The word Indiana literally means land of the Indians, a place inhabited by indigenous people for centuries, long before Europeans landed in North America. It was the land of the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wee, Piankashaw, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Kickapoo, and Chickasaw people, among many others, some so ancient that no one today remembers their names. They believed in a great spirit, watching over everyone that connected all things, and was in all things. They found both wisdom and danger in this land, and yet respected even the most fearsome of beasts, as it came from the Great Spirit. Even today, you can walk through the forest and streams of Indiana and find relics of these noble people. Relics that tell us that something was here before and still remains. More than owning the land, they belong to the land itself. Most were driven from this sacred ground by land treaties and bloodshed. But some say the spirits of the ancestors never left at all. In fact, their presence is still here. They are in the woods, the streams, the wind, the high places watching over. In truth, their ancient blood still flows in many of us. This is the story of Indiana's ancient people, the ancestors. The earliest inhabitants of what would become Indiana lived very simply, in rock shelters and caves, like here at the Potts Creek Rock Shelter in St. Croix. The ancient Hemlock Cliffs Gulch, near English, provided not only ample water, but many caves for shelter. Or here at the Yellow Birch Ravine in Tazewell. There's evidence that these native, ancient people mined for chert and aragonite deep within Wyandot Cave in Crawford County. This huge place, in the dark, must have seemed just as mysterious as it does today, but even more so without the benefit of modern science. They used hickory bark for torches to explore deep inside the cave. Each piece of bark provided about 15 minutes of light, and then you were in the dark. They would thus band together bundles of bark. This ensured they had time to work and a way to get out. A unique type of chert, known as Wyandot chert, is found only here and nowhere else on Earth. Nodules were chipped away and formed into tools. They traded these items with other tribes, hundreds of miles away, as far away as the East Coast. They used deer antlers to pry these precious pieces from the rock. They made a variety of items from stone: spear points, arrowheads, scraping stones, and devices to make holes in buckskin so they could lace their clothes. At Paoli is the Indiana Pioneer Mothers Memorial Forest. In these woods is where Native people lived over 1,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found artifacts and remnants of their village, which sat along Lick Creek. On the west side of the forest is a rugged, primitive trail. However, taking 150 east, just outside of town, reveals a parking lot and much shorter, easier trail to the prehistoric site. The entrance is not well marked, but is Triangle Road. It's a flat, easy path to the bridge and the village site. This is a very unique place. It's one of the best preserved, old-growth forests left in Indiana. However, some will tell you more than old trees live here. By the bridge is a place to stop, take a seat, and reflect. If you sit here long enough and remain quiet, deer and other wildlife will emerge from the woods, as if you're slowly becoming part of the woods. The path along Lick Creek takes you to the village site and back hundreds of years of unknown history. This open place is where Native ancestors went about their daily lives, built fires for their meals, raised children, stored grains for the winter, and worshipped the Great Spirit. It's a very peaceful place, especially so if you have the time to sit and watch the water. And yet, unusual things happen here. Some have heard voices in the wind near the village site. Those taking a walk with their dogs say the dogs don't want to go anywhere near the village site. It's as if they sense something unseen and unsettling. For me, I felt nothing but peace. At the bluffs of Beaver Bend, and all along the river at Shoals, Indiana, are cave dwellings. This ancient area has a presence that's difficult to describe, but very palpable. Browning Mountain is located southwest of Story, Indiana, high atop one of the tallest peaks in Brown County. This area is considered a holy place by Native people today, and is often one of their pilgrimages. Some even ask the Great Spirit for permission before even climbing to the summit. While it starts off easy, it gets more and more steep until it levels out at the top. At the peak are stones that some consider sacred, and for outsiders, a genuine peculiarity. These stones have been cut in the distant past, and arranged for what seems like ceremonial purposes. It's been suggested that these are the ruins of a Stonehenge-like religious structure. There have been stories of a spirit that watches over this place, a guardian. People with ghost meters have picked up very strange voices. One of the more famous stories is of two hikers who reached the top on a clear day. They were admiring the high-up view when an elderly native man appeared on one of the large stones. As he sat there, he looked up to the sky and said, "Looks like rain." And thereafter, a huge downpour fell, despite it being a clear day, with no bad weather in the forecast. The two men struggled greatly to get off the mountain. Various sensitive people have felt an uncomfortable presence here. However, I felt peace. Wapasickisipiwi, near Fairbanks, Indiana, is an isolated place where one can absorb the spirit of the past and the people that lived there. It is absolutely in the middle of nowhere, and it's very easy to have this large place all to yourself. With this kind of isolation, it can serve a great deal of peace, or a great deal of fear. Many would say, you're never really alone at Wapasickisipiwi. Sculptures and other displays evoke stories and imagery of the ancestors. There are two burial mounds. Lenape people, also known as the Delaware Indians, would often bury their dead on top of the more ancient mounds. Curiously, Lenape, roughly translated into English, means the ancient or original people. It has provided speculation that they were in fact the descendants of the ancient mound builders. Dream catchers hang from the shelter. Left by those that have came here to commune with the spirits. For many, it's a place of peace and belonging. And that was my case. When I was there, strangely, it felt like home, just like all the other places. A friend of mine, whom has an Indian heritage, said, "Maybe it's because you're one of them, and they know you." My great-grandmother was a Native American with dark hair and features. While she passed away before I was born, I grew up hearing her Indian stories through my mother. Perhaps because of these stories, I always felt an affinity to Native American things. Great-grandma's family had the facial features and darkened skin. Some of that resides in my family to this very day. We never knew what tribe they'd came from, but I always assumed Miami, as they were the last tribe to live in Indiana. The Miami Nation still has a tribal headquarters at Peru, north of Kokomo, and also this land, east of Rockville, where the public is invited each year. Although they didn't have DNA tests when I was young, I always felt a strange sense that Indian blood was in my veins. A sense of something much deeper, an attachment to the land of Indiana that other people just didn't feel. One of the proudest days of my life was when I finally took a DNA test, and it proved what I had always known. And that's the case with many people living inside Indiana. Almost every person you meet with family that's lived here for generations has some linkage to the tribes, even if their light skin doesn't look it. But like water flowing down a long river, they have a long line of Native American blood flowing inside them. But unlike the faceless, unknown people of the past, we know whom some of the ancestors are. We not only know where they lived, but how they dressed, their favorite foods, and details about their lives. We know their joys, their sorrows, and their struggles as they lived in this land. We know the stories of their brave warriors, the values they taught their children, and the kindness and beauty of their souls. And as we roam across the land of Indiana, a hidden history unfolds before us. While most county museums in Indiana have some Native American artifacts, Terre Haute has an entire museum dedicated to the indigenous people of Indiana. At Dobbs Park, you'll find the Native American Museum, a large space telling the story of Indiana's ancestors. Outside, you'll find a Native American heirloom garden, showing how the people of this land grew crops in an unusual way. They planted corn, squash, and beans together instead of 3 unique crops. They called them the Three Sisters. And just like the tribes themselves, they nourished and supported each other throughout the growing season. Across town, you'll find the Wabash River flowing along Fairbanks Park. This is where the We tribe, a people related to the Miami, live their lives. While the villages are no longer here, there is a sign worth noting. In 1824, before leaving to discuss land treaties with U.S. agents, Chief Jacco bought an ad in the Terre Haute newspaper. As he and the other men of the tribe had to leave their wives and children to attend the meeting far away, they simply requested for the people of Terre Haute not to maltreat them. Despite his efforts, nearly all the members of the We tribe were forced to leave Indiana. It was the early 1800s, before Indiana was even a state. Indiana Territory Governor William Henry Harrison was living at Vincennes in this beautiful home, now known as Grassland. His charge from the president was to acquire land from the Indians and expand the borders of the United States. He made many treaties with tribes, giving them money, goods, and trading them tracts of land out west. But Shawnee Chief Tecumseh said that these tribes had no authority to sell this land to the United States. In 1810, with several hundred warriors, he went to talk with Harrison on his turf. To say it didn't go well is an understatement. Tecumseh ended up pulling out his tomahawk, and Harrison his sword. It's said that the only thing that ended a fight to the death was the sound of Harrison's men cocking their rifles. Neither man trusted each other, nor was willing to compromise. It would lead to the bloodshed of not just 2 men, but hundreds. Tecumseh and the prophet, known as Tensketawah, pulled together a large confederation of tribes with the intent of taking back land given to Harrison and halting U.S. expansion. The people of Prophetstown believed that the prophet had magical powers and performed miracles. He was the unquestioned spiritual leader, and this only strengthened the alliance as they believed he could provide supernatural guidance. However, from Vincennes, William Henry Harrison mocked the prophet. He tried to discredit him and dissolve the Indian resolve at Prophetstown, supposedly saying, if the prophet has magic, let him turn the daytime into night. But that was a huge mistake. The prophet was told of Harrison's challenge and correctly predicted a solar eclipse. When the daytime magically turned to night, everyone thought that the Great Spirit was with the prophet, and with his divine power, they could absolutely win any battle. Established along the Wabash and Tippecanoe River, Prophetstown grew bigger and bigger as Tecumseh gave fiery speeches to tribes across the land. He was gone long periods, and Harrison saw this as an opportunity to attack Prophetstown. Even though his military days were long over, Harrison asked the president to reinstate his command and took troops to attack the prophet while Tecumseh was away. On November 6, 1811, Harrison and about 1,000 soldiers camped at what's now known as Battleground, under 1.5 miles from Prophetstown. He sent word to the prophet that he'd like to meet in the morning, but that meeting never came. Under a waning gibbous moon, Tensketawah told the warriors that they would instead attack Harrison's men in the night, and that his magic would protect them from any bullets or harm. They would be invincible, and victory was assured. They attacked at 4 a.m., taking Harrison's men by surprise. The battle lasted 2 hours, but ended with the prophet and the warriors retreating. 37 of Harrison's men died in battle, with 25 dying later from their wounds. It's estimated that over 50 warriors were killed. Regrouping at Prophetstown, the warriors confronted the prophet, saying his magic did not work. Tensketawah said that he would make new magic, and they could finish what they started, but the damage was already done. The warriors and their families fled Prophetstown, and Tensketawah's leadership was done. On the next day, Harrison's men went to Prophetstown and found it abandoned, except for an elderly woman that was too sick to travel. Harrison ordered the storehouse of winter food and hundreds of dwellings to be burned to the ground. The dream of Prophetstown was over. Now known as the Battle of Tippecanoe, it was a decisive victory for Harrison and United States expansion. While it wasn't the end of Tecumseh, it was the end of the prophet's rule and influence and the stronghold of Prophetstown. The War of 1812 would follow, with Tecumseh pulling together a large confederation of warriors and aligning with the British. But on October 5th, 1813, Harrison and about 4,000 soldiers confronted Tecumseh and the British allies at Ontario, Canada. It would be called the Battle of the Thames. Tecumseh was killed, and the warriors that followed him scattered. But in the shadows, a humiliated and resentful prophet sought vengeance for Prophetstown and for killing his brother, Tecumseh. It's said that he assembled powerful, dark magic, a curse, on not only William Henry Harrison, but every American president after him, each 20 years. These presidents either died in office or came very close to it. These uncanny string of coincidences started in 1840 and have continued to modern times. Some say that Indian curses are just superstition. But William Henry Harrison died just 31 days after he was inaugurated. He had no previous major illnesses. Traveling east of Prophetstown, you'll find Marion and Menshingomesia, the site of a Miami Indian settlement. The people here were farmers, and unlike the nomadic tribes with teepees, they built permanent homes with wooden frames here in Indiana. But after Fort Greenville and Fort Wayne were attacked by native people that were allies with the British in the War of 1812, Miami villages all along the Menominee River were targeted by William Henry Harrison. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel John Campbell and a 600-man cavalry to destroy the villages, while sparing Miami chiefs White Loon, Pecani, Jean-Baptiste Richardville, and Delaware chief Silverhill. Between December 17th and 18th of 1812, a battle was waged here. 48 Miami and Delaware villagers lost their lives, but they didn't go down alone. The Miami and Delaware took 12 soldiers with them. With villages destroyed, native prisoners taken, and relatively few losses, Lieutenant Colonel Campbell considered it a victory. This was despite the fact that 50% of the soldiers, 300 of the 600 that were sent to Menshingomesia, received severe frostbite. Most were so incapacitated that they were deemed unfit for duty. It was truly like a curse was upon the army. The Miami were later given 6,400 acres for a reservation in honor of Chief Metocinya. After his village was destroyed, he spoke to his people about keeping peace. He prevented further attacks against settlers in forts in Indiana, therefore saving many people on both sides. Each year in October, there's a reenactment of the battle, memorializing the people that lost their lives. Some say you can sense the ancestors here, watching those that come here to appreciate history, or to commune with the spirits of the Miami and Delaware. East of the battlefield is a schoolhouse. Native American schools were established in the 1800s. Native Americans easily learned English and used it to share ideas with their neighbors. In return, many places in Indiana received Native American names: Wyandotte, Shakamak, Wabash, Weohtanon, Miami, and Mishawaka, just to name a few. Behind the school is the largest known Native American burial ground in Indiana. Before the mix of cultures, marked burials were not something that was commonly done by Native people. 65 graves are marked, though countless others are not. But in learning the ways of settlers, they embraced it as a way to honor their ancestors, such as Chief Menshingomesia, who led the Miami people to an enduring peace and permanent reservations. As his grandfather was a French fur trader that married a Miami woman, his French name was Francis LaFontaine. He became chief of the Miami in 1828 at only 18 years old. He married the daughter of Miami Chief Jean-Baptiste Richardville, and the two men worked to secure a future for the Miami people. Chief Richardville, also known as Peshiwa, lived at Huntington, Indiana, at the forks of the Wabash. Here you'll find a museum, village, and his actual home, which served as the tribal headquarters for the Miami Nation. Chief Richardville adopted American ways, lived in an American-style home, dressed like an American businessman, and encouraged others to do the same. In addition to achieving reservations and peace for the Miami people, he also became an incredibly wealthy merchant who had a grand home at Fort Wayne. This is where the 1838 Forks of the Wabash Treaty was signed. Under the treaty, $550,000 was given to the Miami, equivalent to about $18 million in today's money. In exchange, over half the Miami population stayed on allocated land in Indiana, could buy land as private individuals, or go to a free reservation west of the Mississippi with their treaty money. For some, this was and always would be home, and chose to stay. They adopted American ways and blended into American society. They attended schools provided by the government and learned about an entirely different world. The treaties were arranged by strong Miami chiefs that were excellent negotiators. Overall, the Miami Nation did pretty well. Those that went to the reservation in Kansas did so by canal boats and steamboats. It was no trail of death by a long shot. And yet, over half of those that took the money and went to the reservation came back to Indiana. However, not all tribes in Indiana were as fortunate. 3 miles southwest of Plymouth is the statue of Potawatomi chief Menominee. He was both chief and religious leader of the Potawatomi, also known as the Preacher, and for good reason. He embraced Christianity and combined it into Potawatomi tribal beliefs. He was strongly against drinking alcohol, even asking religious leaders to establish missions in the Potawatomi villages. He signed many land treaties with the United States in the interest of peace, but his fellow tribesmen literally sold him out. They either ran up large debts for items bought from settlers, or became addicted to their alcohol, thus having to provide land to pay for these debts. They ended up signing a treaty with the federal government without his or other leaders' consent, effectively selling all the Potawatomi land in Indiana. Chief Menominee protested that he and other signatures were forged and the treaty was invalid, but it was already too late. On September 4th, 1838, the federal government, whom had already provided money and land to those tribespeople, forced 859 Potawatomi to walk 3 months and nearly 660 miles to the reservation in Kansas. Known as the Potawatomi Trail of Death, it was the largest Native American removal in Indiana history. Along the way, 42 died. Over half were children. Chief Menominee died just a few years later, and far away from the land that he loved. If you travel to Fort Wayne, Indiana, you'll find a recreation of the old fort. It was built upon the ruins of a large Miami village, Kekionga. Kekionga was the capital of the Miami people, and both Shawnee and Delaware tribes lived in close proximity. The different tribes formed an alliance with each other and with the British. The sole purpose? To defeat the Americans and prevent further settlement of their land. A mighty war chief emerged from this land. At what's now Whitley County, Indiana, between 1747 and 1752, a man named Menshingomesia was born. His name translated into English, the Turtle. To distinguish him between his father by the same name, he was called Little Turtle and became chief of the Miami Indians. But he wasn't so little. As a grown man, he stood at least 6 feet tall. Those that met him described him as a serious, intelligent person. He wore silver jewelry, spoke several languages, but despite the benign sound of his name, he was one of the most fierce war chiefs ever known in America. November 5th, 1780, near what's now Columbia City, Indiana, Little Turtle, whom had sided with the British, attacked Colonel Augustin de la Baume and his men. At the very start of the battle, Little Turtle buried his tomahawk into the head of La Baume's lookout, splitting it in half. La Baume's men were overwhelmed in no time, probably stunned by the brutal killing of the lookout. 30 to 40 of La Baume's men were killed before the battle ended. But the brutality didn't end there. Prisoners were scalped alive by Little Turtle's warriors while they begged for mercy. 3 officers were burned alive at the stake. 1 officer had his hands and feet cut off before being executed with a tomahawk to the head. Little Turtle then released a few prisoners to serve as a warning to others. When soldiers later reached the area, they found the path decorated with the heads of others on sticks and turned back. The ferocious style of Native American fighting and deplorable torture and execution of prisoners by both Little Turtle and other tribes allied to the British was alarming. Future President George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, took action. He ordered Native American villages, their fields, and their winter grain stores burned to the ground in retaliation. Tribes that were once neutral joined the British to fight the Americans. They realized it was a fight for their way of life, and neutrality was not an option. But when the British surrendered in 1783 and ceded all the land to the Americans, the battle had only just begun for Native American sovereignty. In 1787, the Northwest Territory was formed and the fledgling United States had big plans for expansion. Native Americans understood that all the promises made by both the British and French were over. The Americans had no interest in staying on the East Coast. Back and forth skirmishes between settlers and Native Americans were common, and they spilled into Indiana. Neither white people nor Native Americans were blameless. It was a vicious cycle. Innocent people on both sides died. In 1790, President George Washington asked for an army to defeat the Native American hostilities. General Josiah Harmer led the first assault into Indiana, intending to attack the Miami village of Kekionga at present-day Fort Wayne. He arrived there on 17 October, 1790, but to his surprise, he found a ghost town. The village had actually been set on fire. He foolishly assumed that the Native Americans were cowards. It was actually just a big trap. Later that night, Little Turtle's warriors stole about 100 of their horses, limiting how fast they could move, or more importantly, how fast they could get away. The next day, a detachment of about 300 men scouted the area outside of Kekionga, but were spooked when they came upon 50 or so Miami, assumed an imminent ambush, and raced back to the camp. Upon their return, they were reprimanded for not pursuing the Indians, but the days that followed proved that everyone should have left at that moment. On October 19th, another detachment went out to search for the Miamis, but instead found a deserted Miami camp, with a fire still burning as if they had left in a hurry. They reasoned that perhaps the Indians really were cowards, as General Harmer suggested. On the ground were Native American trinkets. The men dropped their guard and started filling their pockets with these handmade items, not knowing that the fierce Miami war chief, Little Turtle, was waiting and well prepared. He was on a hill watching for just the right moment. At Little Turtle's command, a large war party of Miamis, Shawnee, and Potawatomi assaulted the men in the meadow. Hidden in the woods, they could shoot into the meadow, and the soldiers did not know where to return fire. It was a massacre. Many soldiers deserted and ran for their lives. The others that stayed to fight were totally decimated. Their heads were scalped and their bodies were cut into pieces. General Harmer then had every abandoned village, crop, and food store burned to the ground. He then ordered a return to Kekionga, thinking that the Miamis would return, and his force of 400 men would finish them off. But he was wrong. On 22 October, the Americans approached the Maumee River to attack Kekionga. Little Turtle was waiting. One survivor said, "It was like a wall of fire shot across the river, cutting down all the men and turning the water red with blood." Reinforcements came and chased Little Turtle's men, but instead of a retreat, it was simply guiding the reinforcements into another ambush. The battle came to a field in which the Miamis waited until the soldiers all fired their weapons and were reloading. The Miamis then engaged them in brutal hand-to-hand combat. It was later known as the Battle of the Pumpkin Field, not because of pumpkins being grown there, but because of the scalped American heads left in the field when it was over. Having received news of the massacre, General Harmer issued a full retreat. He was so rattled that he left the bodies of the soldiers where they were instead of burying them and risking more casualties. At that point, Little Turtle, with his large number of warriors, could have finished off Harmer and the rest of his forces. But it was a lunar eclipse, and Little Turtle thought that was a bad omen. He left the fight for another day. Upon his return to Camp Washington, General Harmer was relieved of his command and later court-martialed, though he was not convicted. Little Turtle had scored a mighty victory for Native people, but it was far from over. As a second attempt to conquer the resisting Native Americans, General Arthur St. Clair and a large army marched toward Kekionga. Little Turtle and the Confederacy intercepted them on 4 November 1791. Near Fort Recovery, Ohio, out of 1,000 soldiers, only 24 managed to get away unscathed. It remains one of the worst disasters in American military history and was again accomplished by Chief Little Turtle. It seemed like Little Turtle and the Native American Confederacy was unbeatable, but a new American war chief was about to change things. The patience of President Washington was at its end. He then sent General Anthony Wayne to accomplish what the other generals could not. He was also known as Mad Anthony for his disciplined and fierce battle methods during the Revolutionary War. General Wayne gathered 3,500 troops and trained them to be battle-ready. When Native Americans attacked Fort Recovery in June of 1794, they didn't win. Little Turtle was convinced that the tribes should consider a peace treaty, but he was overruled. Near what's now Toledo, Ohio, August 20th, 1794, General Wayne and his well-trained army, called the Legion of the United States, decimated the Native American Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. General Wayne then continued to the Miami village of Kekionga, burning every Native American village, their crops and winter food stores, in a 10-mile wide path. Fort Wayne was then built where Kekionga was, establishing a military presence. Little Turtle realized that a new day had come, and it was a battle that he and the Confederacy of Tribes could never win. He called General Wayne the chief that never sleeps. On August 3rd, 1795, at Greenville, Ohio, General Wayne called tribal leaders together to sign a peace accord, now known as the Treaty of Greenville. In return, tribes would be given annual payments of money, and the promise that the United States would not settle further west than Fort Wayne. Thus, everything west was called Indiana, or the land of the Indians. Little Turtle signed the treaty, and although he discouraged further aggression in Indian alliances, peace would not be immediate. It was but a calm before the storm that would be the War of 1812. Little Turtle died on July 14, 1812, and was buried with full military honors for his dedication to peace. You can visit where he was buried in a little garden in the middle of what's now a downtown Fort Wayne neighborhood. In his lifetime, he met President George Washington and was given a sword. That sword was buried with him, symbolic of the war that was now over. He also became friends with President Thomas Jefferson, writing many letters to discuss agriculture, for which both men had a passion. Inscribed on a rock in the garden, it says, "I have been the last to sign this treaty. I will be the last to break it." His words at the Treaty of Greenville. In keeping to his word, he never fought again. A statue of Little Turtle stands in downtown Fort Wayne, honoring the mighty warrior that lived his later years for peace. People can change, and if a fierce war chief can do it, anyone can. It should be noted that Indiana was the first place in America that outlawed and prosecuted the killing of Native Americans, and it happened here at Pendleton. In 1825, 3 white men were tried, convicted, and hung for killing 9 Native people. These were men, women, and children that were peaceably living along the river. Before that, killing Native Americans was not even considered a crime. All were labeled savages due to the brutal atrocities of a few, and not all tribes. Indiana set an early precedent for civility for others to follow. However, not all tribes fared equally. Land negotiations favored some and punished others. Miami Chief Richardville became one of the wealthiest men in Indiana and built this mansion of a home at Fort Wayne. But there are still scars left, passed over many generations, especially among the tribes that were forced to move out west. Today, Native American culture is celebrated in Indiana. Direct descendants and those with some indigenous blood participate in powwows, like this one at Rockport, Indiana. They are grand events showcasing the culture that used to be so common in Indiana. You can't visit a single southern Indiana gift shop without dream catchers and other Native American items. For every person with a genuine ancestry, there are 10 that identify with and respect it nonetheless. While the majority of Native people have left Indiana's wilderness, the spirit of the ancestors has never left. It was always here, and for always, will ever be.